Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. As we give just a minute or two for folks to log in, if you wouldn't mind in the chat, just putting your name and what city and state you're coming to us from. All right, if you're just joining us, if you could just put your city and state that you are coming to us from. It looks like we've got Ohio, naturally. Couple folks from Arizona, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas, couple folks from Illinois, Louisiana. Awesome, quite a few Arizona folks on here. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So good afternoon, good morning again, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Assessment Centers, a Statewide Approach. My name is Molly Barker-Cook, and I am the Executive Director of the National Assessment Center Association. And as some of you might know, the NACS annual symposium this year was in Columbus, Ohio. There was about 125 of us that came together. And the presentation that you're going to see and hear about today was provided as the part of the opening plenary and a more detailed session as a breakout session. And part of the reason why we're hosting today's webinar is that the feedback we got during that those presentations from attendees was really that they wanted to invite some of the other stakeholders from their jurisdictions to hear about the work that the state of Ohio is doing, and which is why we've kind of turned that session into a virtual format today. So here we are. And we're really here to highlight some of the incredible leadership happening in Ohio, where the Department of Youth Services has emerged really as a national leader in advancing assessment centers, also known throughout the state, which I'm sure you'll hear from Corey and Brittany today, also known as resource centers. So you'll hear that terminology used interchangeably. Over the past several years, Ohio DYS has supported the development of over 22 assessment centers across the state through strategic funding and policy guidance, and really showing a commitment to prevention, diversion, and early intervention through the development of these assessment or resource centers. And while they've been doing that over the last several years, this last year they made a new commitment to the assessment center and resource centers across the state to have access to quality and meaningful data from assessment centers that can help inform their local and state efforts. So this last year, which you'll hear more about this from Corey and Brittany, they partnered with the National Assessment Center Association to launch a pilot using the Assessment Center Outcome Reporting Network that was developed by the NAC as a statewide effort to develop consistent data on resource or assessment centers in order for them to measure outcomes and inform decision making. So that commitment to assessment centers has been had several stages and has supported their development throughout the state. So today we're really fortunate to hear directly from two of the leaders behind the important work at a state level. So they're going to share how Ohio's approach supporting assessment centers really has evolved. What are some of the lessons that can inform efforts in other states? We have many other states on the call today, and their vision for advancing youth justice through their assessment and resource centers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Corey Shreve, who's the Bureau Chief of Community Reinvestment at the Ohio Department of Youth Services. Corey leads efforts to implement evidence-informed grant programs and initiatives that expand community reinvestment opportunities for youth, drawing from his background in juvenile justice and detention reform. Brittany Neal is the State Strategic Initiatives Administrator at the Ohio Department of Youth Services. She leads reform efforts through the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, or JDAI, and partners with counties across the state to reduce unnecessary detention and support youth at home in their communities. So please welcome, or join me, I should say, in welcoming Corey and Brittany.
Thanks, Molly. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We were going to do a brief introduction, but Molly, you killed it and did it for us, so we can hop right in into the webinar. We're excited to share with you about how we as a state have operationalized the advancement of assessment and resource centers across the state of Ohio. And feel free to put your questions in the chat. I believe either Molly or Carly will be moderating that. But we want to take your questions and hear from you all in the work that you're doing in your states. And just a special shout out to all of our Ohio folks that have joined the call today. It's so exciting to see you guys. So I'm going to turn it over to Corey to kick it off for us today.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Not sure where everyone's coming in from today, but we're excited to have another opportunity to kind of highlight some of the work we've done in Ohio around assessment and resource centers. I first want to kind of just start by talking about juvenile justice in Ohio. It's important to understand our foundation and where we're coming from when we talk about these initiatives. So on the screen, what you'll see is where we're at currently, but I want to just kind of give a historical overview of where we've been. And I'll go back as far as 2008, 2009. We are a county locally run system, so we are a home rule state. But in the state of Ohio, we have some different tiers of services and interventions. Our DYS institutions or juvenile correctional facilities are our highest level of care. Then we have our community correctional facilities. Then we have residential and out-of-home placement. And then we would have detention center and then front-end court-involved services for youth. Currently we are at 34 detention centers that are locally funded and operated. Fast forward or rewind back to 2009, we had 40 locally run and operated detention centers. Currently, we are at 3 DYS juvenile correctional facilities. Rewind to 2009, even a little bit before that, we had 11 juvenile correctional facilities spread out throughout the state. We had over 2,800 kids incarcerated in the state of Ohio at the deepest end placement possible. And currently, we are with 3 juvenile correctional facilities, and we have about 450 youth that are incarcerated in those facilities, just over 500 youth in our care and custody at alternative placements as well. So I think it's important to know that Ohio has really focused on reducing the footprint of out-of-home placement and especially around large congregate care. So as we've done that, we're going to talk to you a little bit about how we got to this point. When we talk about the numbers on parole, we used to easily have over 500 kids on parole. Those numbers have been drastically reduced. When we talk about subsidy programs or reclaim, we're going to get into the funding mechanism and how that works. But we've funded over 700 locally operated and funded programs in Ohio throughout 88 counties. We've also been working to consistently implement the Ohio Youth Assessment System and train staff to create fidelity around those programs and interventions. So this is kind of just a little look and overview of juvenile justice in Ohio. So we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of what we're here for today. And we'll kind of come back to this throughout the presentation to reference this. But something that we recently had published in September of 2024 was our Juvenile Justice Working Group report. I feel like Ohio is committed to improving juvenile justice and how we serve youth and families always. So this was a great report that came out. And there are a couple of things that are really important to understand. We've reduced that footprint from 11 facilities to 3 facilities, right? But we want to take that one step further. we want to go from larger facilities to smaller facilities. That was one of the main the working group recommendation is how do we reduce those larger congregate care facilities and break them up into smaller facilities. So the first phase of that project is underway. Our Cuyahoga Hills facility is going to be broken down from one facility into four smaller facilities that'll be located in different areas throughout that northern part of our state. And so we're excited about that. We know smaller is better. We know we can serve and provide better interventions when we have smaller groups. So we're really looking forward to that. The other one that is important, there were a number of recommendations. So you can scan that QR code and you can go and see the full report. We also have working reports that are kind of showing the progress of all these initiatives that we have underway. But one of those was collaboration across state agencies. And, that work group recommendation came to our division of community reinvestment. And it's been a great one for us because we have great partnerships and we have great resources like our assessment and resource centers to highlight and show how state partners can collaborate. So I'll get into that a little bit more as we move forward. But one of the other one was to develop family resources for communities through local juvenile court partners. So great, that's a great recommendation for us. And we can go to the next slide because we're going to do that. There are 23 resource and assessment centers in 23 different counties in Ohio. Each is independently run and they're locally run, but many are state supported, right? So we want to provide a level of support and guidance to our local court partners and how they stand these up and operate them. But none look the same, none operate exactly the same, but the focus is always the same, right? I say a lot that our resource and assessment centers are intended to act as the barrier to the juvenile justice system. And I don't only mean juvenile justice system going back to those recommendations, but I mean system in general. How do we help provide those basic needs and supports to families before we actually involve them in some type of system? So you can look at the map and see how they're spread geographically throughout the state of Ohio. But Franklin County is our largest metropolitan county. And then we have, as an example, Paulding County, which is one of our smaller, more rural counties. And those two assessment centers don't look the same. They don't serve the same number of kids. But the overarching goal is to serve kids in the least restrictive way possible while keeping them in the community. So we're pretty excited about this, and we continue to push these efforts forward to take them to scale. So it's pretty exciting. Little history and how we got started. And I jump around a lot, so we might go to a slide that I've already talked about, so just forgive me ahead of time. But Montgomery County back in 1997, before we started any of these initiatives, had the forward thinking to say, hey, we need a place for law enforcement to bring kids in lieu of secure detention. So as they build a new juvenile justice center that housed their court, their local detention center, some of their programmatic operations, they also built a resource center or an assessment center where kids could be brought in by law enforcement and there was local mental health screening available to them. There were mediation and some different services that were able to be provided. They actually created a way for parents to file parent complaints to this assessment and resource center. So we were really lucky because we had one site start this well before we really thought to take this to scale. When we really started thinking about, man, how do we ramp this up? It probably happened 2010, 2009, and we had two major initiatives going on during that time. And this is where I jump around a little bit. So I'm gonna jump around here to this slide, but we launched the Target Reclaim Initiative, and we also partnered with the Annie E. Casey Foundation to implement the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative here in Ohio. We started with 5 pilot sites for the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. And they were the foundation and building blocks to a lot of our expansion and how we grow programs in Ohio. I like to say we support that the state supports, but our local partners grow these programs. They're the ones who implement it. They're the ones who share it locally. They help others build this up and lift this up. But the other one was targeted reclaim, where we looked at counties that committed the most youth to the Department of Youth Services. And we said, how do we really work diligently with them to create alternatives to youth coming to DYS or CCF? So this program focused on felony level offenders that would otherwise come to DYS or a community correctional facility. And so this is really when we started to see a huge reduction in population for our youth that were in congregate care and local detention centers. We saw it in our state correctional facilities and other residential out-of-home placements. Now, this same thing happened across the country, but we can tell through our data and analytics of what we've done that we see that these two things have had a significant impact on an even further reduction. So we'll go back to the kind of timeline slide here and look at 2013 to 2017. Those that are familiar with the JDAI, there are 8 core principles. One of those core principles is collaboration. The other is data-driven approaches. And as it's stated in the name, you have to create good alternatives for detention. So as we're educating judges and magistrates and local court partners on how we can serve kids, what alternative are we going to give to our jurists? What are we going to give to the magistrates? What are we going to give to parents? And so this is where we brought Lucas, Franklin, and Ashtabula County on board with assessment centers. And they were done as an alternative to detention. This is really before we started to expand what we would call state scale for assessment centers across Ohio. Lucas County, again, very similar to Montgomery County, wanted to have a place where they could use a detention screening tool, where they could use other assessments and evaluation tools to find and place kids in safe alternatives. Franklin County at that time, I think they traveled across the country to Louisiana to look at some things that were happening there and some other places, and partnered with one of our local service providers to stand up the first version of their assessment and resource center that really focused on detention screening as well. If a youth was screened out of their local detention center, they would go to this provider for services and interventions. And it was like that kind of first time where we created a single point of contact for youth and families to try to be provided the services they needed. And Ashtabula County is definitely a leader in what we've done here in Ohio. Ashtabula County actually closed their local detention center and took their resource center to scale. I'm sure many of you have heard from them before if you've been on this call, but it was a bold step in what they did. So it kind of, these 4 counties really led the way for us to expand this initiative. So, COVID hit, and right as COVID was hitting, we were onboarding counties for JDAI and we were creating more alternatives. And we also launched our competitive reclaim program, which I'll talk about more in depth later on. But you can see that we onboarded Cuyahoga, Fairfield, Lorraine, Marion, Delaware, Greene, Hamilton, and Paulding County. One thing I like to point out when I'm talking about this is we've onboarded people more than once too. We definitely have had failed attempts where we've had to recreate or rethink how we did a lot of these things. In 2019, as you can imagine, as we're onboarding, we think, oh man, we're going to operate 24 hours a day and we're going to serve and see all these kids, or here are our hours of operation, and boom, everything shuts down. So now we have to be creative, and we've had counties really think outside the box and create an on-call system to be able to do assessments and evaluations to try to limit those kids from going to a local detention center. In 22 and 23, we brought another 5 counties on with Allen, Shelby, Coshocton, Clinton, and Jackson. And then in 2024, you can see that we brought another 6 counties on, and we're currently in the process of onboarding Logan County, which brings us to our 23rd county that we're bringing on. And what is our vision for resource and assessment centers? And today you'll hear me say assessment resource, which I yell at myself for that, and I often correct other people. No, we should say resource and assessment. When we say assessment, we think something's wrong, right? You got to fix something. But we want to be a resource, and we want to be that community-based resource that is a single point of contact for youth and families. How can we screen them, or how can we just simply ask that their basic needs are being met? Do you have food insecurity? Do you need something? Do you need clothing? How do we link them to the people in their community that can serve them best? And we also, as I said earlier, want these to act as the barrier to the juvenile justice system. So we're heavily focused on how we divert youth from formal court involvement. So these resource and assessment centers can be that link, not only for justice involved youth, but it could be any youth that's involved with any kind of system. So they could be a dually involved youth or a crossover youth or anyone who needs assistance, depending on the level of services or interventions offered at that particular center. But this is one way to create a community-based alternative to secure detention. So far, we have invested heavily in the local detention alternatives initiative, but we've invested over $6.1 million in the initial development of centers across the state. So I'll talk a little more in depth about how that works and what that looks like. But 6.1 million just to stand up and start. That's not ongoing funding. So many of you are from other states. How do you invest these dollars? Like, where do you get these dollars from, and how do they work? So that's what I'm going to talk to you all about today, is a little bit of our funding mechanism and how we maintain funding at the local level. So you'll see the pyramid in front of you, and we call this subsidy grant funding. Many people refer to this nationally as reclaim. We call it the reclaim subsidy grant, and we have some foundation funding that would be the youth services grant. This is our foundation funding. The youth services grant are dollars that are allocated through the legislator for DYS to administer to all 88 county juvenile courts. This is a census-based grant, so our smallest counties receive a set amount of funding, and then based on population, that funding is increased, with our most populated county receiving the most of those dollars. And that's set with census, so that changes only when the census changes. And that's just over $16 million for that. And that's not just for resource and assessment centers. That's for all locally operated and funded programs that fit and meet our grant criteria that Brittany will talk a little bit more about. Then we have the Reclaim Ohio grant. This is our formula-based grant. The intention of this grant is to allow counties to create a menu of options to serve kids in their communities. And when we do this, we have incentivized community alternatives to be created for low-level, low-risk offenders. And we've done this all through research and data. Reclaim is probably one of the most studied programs we've had in Ohio. And it's something that we want to use data to guide decisions. And we know when kids are kept at home, when they're kept out of secure confinement, they're more successful. So that is the main purpose. How do we keep kids out? And I won't get into the formula of the grant. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. But I'll give you a high-level overview that each county is awarded so many credits based on the felony adjudications over a 10-year period. So we use a 10-year average of felony adjudications, and a county is allotted credits based on how many adjudications they have. And so it's like a debit or a credit card. Depending how many credits they use in that fiscal year, right, will depend on how much money they receive the next fiscal year. So we never impact someone's money in that year, but it impacts the following year. So if you use all your credits, you're not going to get any money. But if you have remaining credits, that's divided using formulas and factors. And then roughly $32.6 million is then divided amongst those with remaining bed day credits. And that can be used for specific programs and interventions for youth and families. So that is what we call the cornerstone, the youth services grant and reclaim grant. That's how we create a consistent base level of funding for counties to provide programs. Not all counties have to choose to be in the reclaim program. So it is a choice, and all 88 counties do participate in the reclaim grant, which is outstanding. But then we have three other categories of funding that get very specific. And that's where we get into target reclaim that I spoke about a little earlier. And that's specifically for felony level offenders. We have 15 counties that participate in that initiative, and they get a set amount of funding for that. The other big program that really links well with resource and assessment centers is our behavioral health juvenile justice program. This is a partnership with Mental Health and Addiction Services, Case Western Reserve University, where we serve dually involved youth that have justice involvement or have some type of mental health or substance abuse issue. So this can be done with kids that are on the very deepest end of the continuum, or this can be done on the front end with families who need specific service. Some of those interventions that are provided there, like MST or FFT, basically we focus on any IHBT service that is out there for counties if they choose to use that. BHJJ is on a competitive basis. We put out a proposal every 2 years. They're funded in a 2-year cycle. So of course, competitively compete for that with our local community partners. We were able to expand from 11 sites to 50 or 13 sites this last fiscal year. So we're really excited about that. And then we get to competitive reclaim, which is kind of the foundation for how we build and expand resource centers. So when I talk about competitive reclaim, it started early on with some simple diversion grants, and we wanted to see what county court partners really needed. But it started with a small handful of folks who started a diversion program, and it was some, just to use an example, would be like a truancy diversion program. And at that time, we required third-party QA from a university partner. It was for a very small amount of money, but we wanted to prove and make sure whatever we were putting funding towards, it was evidence-informed, and there was research to back up what we were doing with kids. So if you go back to that chain and kind of look at where we were at in the onboarding of resource centers, in 2018, 2019, we started to create a specific category for resource and assessment centers. And that category has been something we have supported throughout time. And so to the point of spending over $6 million in the initial investment in standing up resource and assessment centers. Excuse me. And I'll talk a little bit more about the foundation and the mechanics of competitive reclaim, but overall, that's a grant where we serve a high number of youth. Then the other one is JDI onboarding. We're a JDI state scale site. We have 88 counties in Ohio, but we have 19 JDI sites, and we're continuing our efforts to expand that. One of the things for us in Ohio, when we talk about state scale, it's not about getting every county on board, right? For us, it's about counties whose philosophy is aligned with that of DYS and JDAI. So using the My Child principle, how do we want to invest in kids? Also, we have to look at size and scale for ourselves. So, excuse me. The 19 counties that we have on board reach just under 70% of the total juvenile population in Ohio that would be served or touched by a local juvenile court. So we're really excited about that and want to continue to expand that. I'm sorry I'm choking, but I also told you that I jump around. So when we developed this, we wanted to figure out how do we divert appropriate youth. When we think about competitive reclaim, it has to be some type of program or intervention that is locally operated and run in the community. So we don't pay for any congregate care, or any respite care, or anything like that. We have done some things with a touch of respite care or case management for that. But realistically, what we really try to do is how do we support and use our dollars the best way possible? And we know if we place a kid out of home, it costs a lot of money. there's a lot of repercussions to that. So we created a number of initiatives. Excuse me. Um, I don't know about you all, but this is my least favorite part about a Zoom meeting. Allergies are running high here in Ohio, so I apologize. Um, yeah, please. All right, so some of the requirements for competitive reclaim. Um, when we think about how we're serving kids, we want to screen kids first. Youth must be minimally assessed, right? Using appropriate tools. So we use the youth assessment system. A lot of our courts use the diversion OYAS, or a similar tool to screen and assess youth for diversion or for whatever type of program they might be entering. And I'll talk a little more specifically about some of the programs to give you an idea around competitive. But quality assurance is really important. We want to be a data-driven state that we ensure program fidelity and make sure that we can provide appropriate training, including coaching and data collection and evaluation, which you'll hear about later on in the presentation today. I mentioned this, but residential services are not an allowable activity through competitive. We have looked at some short-term respite options in the past. So here are some of the types of competitive programs. Community diversion is a big one that we focused on most recently. Early on in the competitive days, evidence-based programming was one that's huge. Like any evidence-based program that a court would implement, they would have to have third-party evaluation. But like a community diversion program, for example, they wouldn't necessarily need that. We did alternatives to detention, just a simple category that the counties could tell us what they were looking for, what they needed to set up as an alternative to detention. Like I said, we've been a longtime Casey partner. So we have a lot of probation transformation sites in Ohio. So enhanced probation was a category that we funded. One of the big ones we recently funded was community service and restitution. How do we get kids an opportunity to have some victim restoration too? So one of these ways was to provide creative and good community service opportunities where restitution could be then paid back to victims. We had REI coordinators and direct service strategies. A big one for us that goes across all categories and has continued to be a very popular category was pro-social activities. If you have an evidence-based or evidence-informed program that you're funding, you're eligible to use pro-social dollars to support that program. When we talk about pro-social programs, we think about things like, I always go to the sports one first, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say art and music because I can't draw or I can't sing, I can't dance, I can't do any of those things. But I do love to lift weights and do things like that. So CrossFit as an example, or any type of art-related programs. Sometimes even vocational and educational experiences through the pro-social opportunities. But hiking, fishing, we really look for this to be sustainable activities, not rewards, but actually activities that bond a kid to their community and give them something to be a part of, far past stopping in a resource or assessment center. So that's a big one for us. And those go in conjunction with a lot of the other programs that we're doing. Most recently, these are some of our core programs that we're working on now, but it aligns with everything we've done, since 2009, right? Police and pre-arrest diversion and deflection. How are we working with our community partners and our local police agencies to give them the tools and ability to divert kids into other alternatives or programs? Credible messenger programs and credible messenger mentors is a huge program. It's one of the best ways to reduce risk and serve kids in their community, where again, you don't need a resource there, or you don't need a referral, you don't need a court order, but finding that person in your community that you can relate to and talk to that can help. Restorative justice programs, this has been a big one for us, is how do we create more restorative justice programs that are operated by local jurisdictions and as an example, when I say local jurisdictions, I mean that are supported by the court, but might be operated in a school, as an example. Violence interruption has been a big one. When we think about that, we think about violence interrupters. Again, this aligns with credible messengers or any way that we can create community outreach to interrupt youth that are going to commit violence or work with kids who are just simply carrying firearms. We see that as a huge problem in Ohio. And then again, something we'll always continue to fund and support, and that's our resource and assessment centers here in Ohio. So how does competitive work from a funding perspective? All competitive grant awards typically are 2 years of grant funding to those counties who are selected through a competitive process. We put out a request for proposals for that, and that happens sometimes multiple times within a fiscal year. But like our resource and assessment grants are limited up to $175,000 per year. We do always put a clause in there if there's additional funds needed. Provide us the extensive justification, and we'll work with you. We know that it's not costs in every county are not the same. So how can we work with a county to help them stand that up or support that? We'll do that. So not all are that amount either. Not everyone needs that much to stand up. One thing that we've tried to do too, because we know how difficult it can be, is if there's good progress made in that 2 years of grant award, we've offered a third year of funding to sustain and support that. So if you go back to the pyramid where I talked about the youth services grant being the foundation and the reclaim grant being our cornerstone grants, once competitive funds are expended, then a county court can actually use their youth services and reclaim funding to support or ongoing support of the resource and assessment centers. So there's not just one way to do that. The competitive stands it up, and that's where the 6.1 investment was, the 6.1 million investment. But then there are hundreds of thousands of dollars that are used by local court partners as they see fit to run these resource and assessment centers. And this is where we're going to talk about the data and get into a little more detail, but it's really exciting to be able to have these funds available. And we continue to strive to collect data to make sure we can fund as many of these as we possibly can. And we continue to grow how they look and how they operate in our communities. All right, enough for me. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany.
Okay, guys, so just a little bit of a background. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the expectations for those counties that were applying for competitive reclaim dollars for resource and assessment centers. Like Corey said a moment ago, the majority of the over $60 million that we give to juvenile courts throughout the state of Ohio is filtered through the allocation process of the subsidies grant, which includes the youth services grant and the Reclaim Ohio grant. And with those two grants, counties don't have to necessarily put in some type of grant proposal. We only have this unique process of a competitive grant proposal for our BHJJ grants, as well as our competitive reclaim grants. Now, for all other programs that courts will be using their dollars for, they just have to send to us a application, which really is just an idea with some narratives and budgets on how they plan to use the dollars that we give to them. And they can pretty much use those dollars for just about anything they can think of to keep kids away from our juvenile correctional facilities. And so we're going to talk against more specifically just for competitive reclaim and the expectations of the proposal. I know there's a lot of stuff here on this first slide, but I know that some folks like to either take screenshots or just read along instead of listening. But I figured I'd put as much information as possible for other states that may be thinking about like how could we do something similar. And so for the Resource and Assessment Center's grant proposal expectations, we wanted counties to first identify and clarify their purpose. And the purpose for our Resource and Assessment Centers must be to either assess and address the needs of youth that are either eligible for diversion, from detention or other out-of-home placement, or youth that are identified as being at risk of towards delinquent behavior, or those that may just be in need of the basic fundamental needs that they have. So we wanted to make sure that the intended purpose of this was to really get youth and families assessed and screened for things that they may need, and then also have the opportunity for sites to refer out. But the bigger thing is really creating these community-based centered hubs where families, regardless of their involvement in the juvenile justice system, can really just walk in and get access to the things that they need. Because we believe that a youth and family shouldn't have to be criminalized in order to get access to the things to really help them progress in their lives. The other expectation for the proposal was for sites to clearly identify the location and whatever type of center that they were proposing, it had to be held away from the juvenile court and collaboratively with some type of community partner. Now, here's where we've given a little bit of flexibility, because we understand that when folks are submitting grant proposals, they may not always have a location already identified. And so we have allowed sites who maybe are just starting out and are seeking out location and spaces and community partners to collaborate with to begin their resource or assessment center in maybe an office building at the courthouse, with the intention that soon after receiving the grant dollars, they'll be able to expand into a local community space with other community partners or providers. And so many of our 23 centers actually really started in that fashion. They started with just someone getting an office space, and then shortly after progressing to a community space away from the juvenile court. The other thing is just really we wanted folks to identify the activities that they were going to be doing with kids. So obviously, as we all know, for resource and assessment centers, they should be providing some type of screening and or assessment. Many of our resource and assessment centers do primarily just provide some type of screenings, although we do have some centers that are working with different mental health providers to do more lengthy assessments, and they have those providers in-house with them, so families can get access to any needed assessment within the centers. But a majority of them are just providing different screenings. Many of them, like Corey mentioned earlier, are doing the OYAS, though others are doing things like the Maisie. They may be doing the GAIN short screener, some type of social determinants of health screening. I know some folks are using the GIF. But there's a plethora of other screeners that folks are using, but they have to identify that. And then also, any type of direct service that they're providing for youth and families. So I'll have a slide later that kind of just shows some of the services that our resource and assessment centers are providing to youth and families. But in terms of the proposal, we just asked them to identify that. Additionally, as part of the grant proposal, we have the expectation that courts really, again, work with community and invest in community, and create some type of community collaborative to really focus on the needs of youth and families. And we've asked sites to find opportunities to partner with other grassroots organizations or service providers in their community. And as part of the proposal, submit to us a letter of collaboration with that community partner to really outline and talk about their commitment and how they are going to be invested with the court in this process. And then obviously, like Corey said, for not just resource and assessment centers, but for virtually all of our programs, really aligning like whatever you're doing with best practices. And so we again have partnered really closely with the NAC, with many of our resources and assessment centers, and have referenced the NAC's assessment center model guide, guiding principles, and the assessment center framework. in our request for proposals and ask sites to really look at those frameworks in terms of supporting or developing their center. The other things that we have had expectations about in terms of resource and assessment centers for virtually any program, honestly, that we fund, whether it be through competitive reclaim dollars or through the subsidy grant dollars, is that that courts do some type of quality assurance that really takes time to look at the services that are being provided, ensuring that they're done with fidelity and they're not incorporating practices that essentially harm youth or families. And then anytime there is a service provider who is doing some type of service for the court, that there's some quality assurance with that service provider to say, hey, how do we know that this provider is doing and providing the service that they say that they are going to do? And what are their internal processes? So what does the service provider do internally in terms of quality assurance? And really, it's just to make sure that, number one, our dollars are being invested appropriately to ensure that youth and families are getting the best quality services from providers and or folks from the court. And so in addition to that, in the proposal, we've also asked for sites to give us a really detailed budget on how they plan to use the dollars that we have given them in terms of building up resource and assessment centers. And so in the proposal, they'll give us at least a project period of 12 months, a narrative around that. And we've actually allowed for sites to use some of those dollars for equipment purchases, as long as there is some type of justification associated with that. In the past, we've also allowed for some sites to use dollars to go towards rent in a certain community-based center or location where they may be starting up their resource and assessment center. So we've been flexible in that regard to allow some sites to use that for some temporary dollars towards rent while they find opportunities to build capacity around that. And then again, we want some type of either narrative or letter of support from community partners, because it's very important for us to know that the community is very much invested in resource and assessment centers with the court. Again, our dollars go directly to court, but our bureau is the Bureau of Community Reinvestment, and so we advocate very strongly that courts find opportunities to get those dollars back into the community. And so it was important for us to have sites find community partners and get those letters of support and letters of collaboration with them. Some sites have kind of gone above and beyond in getting those letters of support. They're getting them from their local schools, local mental health providers, law enforcement partners, other grassroots organizations. And there's one county, I'm not sure if they're on the call, but Coshocton County, I know in Ohio, they actually have taken time to post those letters of support in their resource and assessment center. So when youth and families come in or other folks around the state come into their resource and assessment center, they can see that there are several community agencies and stakeholders that are very much so invested in this process as well. And then in the proposal, when we were scoring out the applicants, we actually gave a couple extra bonus points for those courts that propose actually co-locating with service providers. So not just being in a community-based setting, but actually having several other community-based organizations housed in the center with them. So we have several courts that have that as well, that have partnered with different service providers to be located in the same space for youth and families. So in terms of what the proposals actually look like, In the past, and this is kind of just where we have learned and grown from, but in the past, we actually were requiring folks when they submitted an application for their competitive reclaim dollars to really do some type of like 50-page dissertation that really took a lot of time and a lot of effort and really a lot of reading on our part to really go through every single one of those. But as our responsibility as a state, we wanted to ensure, again, dollars got to community and we remove any really red tape that may cause any type of hindrance to folks really applying and going after those dollars. And so we decided a couple years ago to really simplify the application process. So no longer are courts having to be required to submit to us an abstract and our thesis, which by the way, really did happen at one point. Like Corey said, for very small amounts of dollars, but we decided to really focus on the things that we really wanted to see in an application, and we simplified it. And here on the screen is just an example of that. Now, all sites, regardless if they're getting competitive reclaim dollars, regardless if they're a resource or assessment center, any type of program, they're going to do a similar type of narrative to kind of just explain how are they using the dollars that we give them. And this narrative here is really what we've used specifically for resource and assessment centers. And so you'll see here, it's several pages long, and I'll go through it pretty quickly with you guys. But we just asked for some very basic information, like the name of the program, you know, what are the primary interventions that you're going to do? Are you going to do some type of how are you going to do the quality assurance? In the past, we actually required, like Corey said, sites to have some type of third-party QA with a university partner. And while that was appropriate for the time and for one of our other funding streams, we keep that. We actually removed that as a barrier for our sites to applying for these types of dollars. And then the other, along with the program information, we just asked for some very general target population information on who they plan to serve from this program. The next page really gives a little bit of insight where we're diving deeper and when we ask them to explain to us what they're actually going to be doing. Now, the first thing that you'll see at the very top is we ask courts to identify a program outcome for their program, for their resource and assessment center. And actually developing an outcome is an expectation that we have of all of our programs that we fund with this over $60 million that we give to juvenile courts. But for specifically resource and assessment centers, we have the expectation that the court can create some type of outcome measure that they can track for each kid who participates in the program at least 12 months post completion. Now, most of our courts are using some type of measure that measures recidivism. Like no new charges, no delinquency charges, and then others are measuring, for example, no new out-of-home placement or something like that. We've allowed them to be somewhat flexible in what they decide that they want to measure, but for this program, they have to measure whatever it is at least 12 months after a kid completes the program. And then this is where we'll get into the program description. And so again, we try to really simplify this for juvenile courts. So no longer are they writing paragraphs and paragraphs and pages worth of things that they plan to do, but really just answering the questions here. And it made it easier for not only them to apply and just state clearly what they plan to do with the dollars, but then when it came to us in terms of scoring for this particular grant, it was easy because we were able to see whether or not, hey, was it there? Was it not there? The things that we have. Now, what we probably won't accept is just like one sentence answers for some of these. We do expect there to be some type of detail in that program description in each of these boxes. Again, for this line of dollars, it is a competitive process. And so we do want to see really clear descriptions in each of these boxes, but no longer does it have to be, pages and pages long. And then again, just going back to the quality assurance, explaining in detail that quality assurance process, and then just identifying who is the contact person for this program, or in this case, the resource or assessment center. And then who is going to be responsible for the quality assurance. And so that's pretty much it in terms of like the application and giving us the detail of that. We post these types of narratives on our website. So they're easily accessible for all of our courts to pull straight down from the website. I mean, it's a public website. Any of you can actually go to the website and see this particular narrative or other narratives that we have for courts and for our other funding streams. But we try to make it, again, as simple as possible and really focus on just getting the dollars to courts to give to communities to provide services for youth and families. So I touched on a little bit about the data and really wanting courts to track some type of outcome. And so I just will get into a little bit about some of the data reporting. So for resource and assessment centers, and similarly other programs that we would consider behavior change programs, we ask courts to really track youth individually in terms of how they're doing in the program. And so we ask for just some really basic things from them. A lot of information around youth disaggregated data by race and ethnicity. So pretty much just the demographics, the offense information, like really what brought them to the court, and if there's a risk level, if they were formally involved with the court. At times we allow them to just put at risk if they weren't necessarily involved with the court formally, the date that the youth was referred, the date that they were admitted into the program or received the intervention, and then the date that they completed the intervention. Then we ask them to give us information on whether or not the youth completed on successful, neutral, or unsuccessful status. And we've allowed courts to really identify their own definitions of success and unsuccessful. So we've kind of left that up to them to decide. The only thing is, in terms of neutral, we kind of have a uniform language on what we expect as neutral, because we had some folks that were probably marking kids as neutral that really should have been either successful or unsuccessful. And so for neutral, we just expect them to use that court category for any time a youth maybe terminates the program by no fault of their own. So maybe a youth moved out of county, they were pushed into a higher level of care or higher level service, or maybe they unfortunately passed away. But other than that, a youth should be completing on a successful or unsuccessful status, and that is defined by the court. And then, in addition to completion status, we also ask again about that outcome measure, whether or not they achieved that primary outcome that the court defined in that narrative that was going to be their primary outcome. And in this case, it is a 1-year post-completion outcome measure. And so I put, as much as I could, a screenshot of that tracking spreadsheet that we have had courts really use to track the kids. I couldn't fit it all on there, so just imagine on your screens that there are about 50 other columns to the right of your screen there. But this just gives you an interesting or a good perspective on what we've asked of courts. Now, I will say we are working specifically for resource and assessment centers to really advance how we collect data. And at the beginning of this fiscal year, which for us started in July, we launched the Acorn, Ohio project with a pilot of about 7 counties in collaboration with the NAC. and our resource and assessment centers. And really, ACORN, as you can see here, stands for the Assessment Center Outcome Reporting Network. And it was really just designed to be an opportunity for sites, not just in Ohio, but around the nation, to improve their quality of data and create some type of streamlined, uniform process of collecting data in more detail around the kids and families that are served in resource and assessment centers. And so we wanted to find an opportunity to gather more information outside of just what we required that I showed earlier. And so we've launched that in collaboration with the NAC and Case Western Reserve University in Ohio with 7 of our sites. As part of the Acorn Ohio project, Molly and her team were very instrumental in providing one-to-one technical assistance for those counties. And what we're really excited about with that pilot project and with the collection of that data is that it will have a capability to create some really cool data visuals for our juvenile courts that they can then use to take to community leaders and court leadership and stakeholders to really show the impact that resource and assessment centers have made throughout the state. And so if you haven't heard about ACORN, I highly encourage you to reach out to Molly to learn more about how you can implement something similar with your resource and assessment centers. So like Corey started out in the presentation, you know, all of our resource and assessment centers, each are locally run. So where we give them the funding, for many of them, we've given funding to operate their resource and assessment centers. Each of them are run locally by juvenile courts, and they vary in their functionality. Some of them offer, in addition to offering screening and assessment, they're also being used as diversion centers. A lot of them are providing early intervention services as well, doing some case management. Many of them are providing access to basic needs of things. They have clothing pantries, food pantries, transportation services. We also have a center that's providing, in collaboration with a community partner, pediatric care. There's folks that are doing parenting classes, family navigation, crisis intervention, so many things. And then again, many of them are being used as a reception center in lieu of detention and serving as an alternative to detention. So despite being locally run, we do really work hard with sites to provide just additional support on the state level to them in resource and assessment centers. And one of those is done through the State Resource and Assessment Center Learning Collaborative. And this is just a space where folks around the state who have resource and assessment centers, or those who are interested in having resource and assessment centers, can come together, meet virtually each month to really learn from each other and do some peer-to-peer TA. It's co-chaired by 2 local resource center staff who I believe I saw were on the call, Nick from Greene County and Lisa from Shelby County. And so they really take the lead in really keeping the group organized and together and being just that space where sites can really bounce ideas off of each other, talk about trends that they're seeing in their centers, and really hear from each other on what's working. And then in addition to that, we really have built in opportunities for centers around the state to actually see and practice what each other is doing in person. And so we really try to schedule a few on-site tours with each other, so folks can really learn and see firsthand what they're doing. And again, it's an opportunity for folks to really learn and see about what's working for centers around the state. Other ways that we really provide additional support for resource and assessment centers is by providing a lot of training opportunities. So a lot of times we will use the dollars that we have to actually fund and provide and host training for sites because we know that a lot of our resource and assessment center staff, they do more than just screening. They provide other interventions, very brief interventions or very brief services to youth and families, in addition to what they're doing to connect them to communities. And so we wanted to provide them opportunities for different trainings. So we offered training in the ROCA Rewire CBT framework. We've also provided training to courts through the Parent Project and Strengthening Families frameworks. We've also provided some basic motivational interviewing training and carry guides to courts. And then again, with the expectation that we have that sites use the OYAS or Ohio Youth Assessment System tool, we regularly provide the training or certification in that tool for courts so that they don't have to use their dollars if they don't need to for that. They can actually just attend the training. And then again, we are funding the ACORN data reporting project for those sites that are participating in the cohort. So resource and assessment centers in Ohio, we're really proud of the success that all of our sites have had over the years. Again, like Corey said, the majority of our resource and assessment centers have just started and really just beginning the process within the last 6 years. And so the success that they have is just a testament to the hard work that they've done in a very short amount of time. And that success includes the closure of 2 local detention centers, which we are really excited about. That occurred in 2 counties where they have been able to successfully shut down detention in their county and repurpose either that space or a similar space for resource and assessment centers. And then the closing down and repurposing of at least 2 juvenile court-run residential treatment facilities. So we had a couple courts that actually had residential treatment facilities on their campus or on site that was run by the court. And since the implementation of their resource and assessment center and really taking a look at the data of who really is best served in their community, they were able to close those down, which really means that more youth and families or more kids are able to remain with their families in the communities and away from out-of-home placement. And then I just have a little bit of data to share with you guys. Again, we're excited about the ACORN pilot project that's happening right now and to get more data visuals for you. But just quickly, from the data that we do have, the data that you're seeing here is from fiscal year 2024, is the last fiscal year that we have complete data for right now. And based upon that data, of the over 4,600 kids that were released from Resource and Assessment Center programming, 82% were released on a successful status. And so we're very excited about that and the work that courts have done to really work with youth and families, but not just youth that are completing on a successful status. For the youth that we were able to collect outcome measures for that 12-month following period from the time that they were released, 80% of those youth achieved their primary outcome, which is again typically some type of recidivism measure. And so it's just a testament and an underscore that keeping kids in their communities away from formal court processing and providing services on the front end is widely successful. It's a widely successful practice. So what do we think about and envision for what's next? Like we've said before, we have 23 resource and assessment centers, so we really want to expand that into getting into other counties. We have 88 counties in the state, and so maybe we won't have a resource and assessment center in all 88 counties, but we really would like to see that expand across the state beyond just the 23, but also really multiple resource and assessment centers within the same county, because we understand that in counties where it's a pretty large county by region, having resource and assessment centers in one location may not always be as accessible to a family who maybe lives, a good ways away from that resource and assessment center. And so we're working with sites to really find opportunities to add more resource and assessment centers when appropriate in their county, to just be more accessible to youth and families. The other hope is that we can continue to collaborate with other state partners in the advancement of resource and assessment centers. And we've really been working with other state partners to talk about how we can come together to provide more dollars to expand these services, so that it just doesn't come from our agency at the Department of Youth Services, but other folks coming on board to really work together to provide financial support and funding for resource and assessment centers. In addition, our hope is to really find resource and assessment centers that are community run and court supported. So like I said earlier, as it stands right now, the majority of our resource and assessment centers are court run and supported by us at the state. But we really want to elevate that and work with our community stakeholders so that those centers are really run by the community, and not so much as court people or court staff running them, but again, being supported by the court staff. And then, like I've said before, continuing to expand our data collection and reporting process through Acorn. Hopefully after the pilot project with the 7 sites that we have, our hope is to expand that to our other resource and assessment centers so that we have a unified way of collecting the data and really having the opportunity to visualize that data. So that's what we have. Thank you guys so much for really tuning in. And I see there were, I think, a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to stop my screen share. But before I stop, I'll let you take some time if you want to just take my information or Corey information down. This is not a picture of Corey or I. If you can see us on the screen, that's not us. We don't have a bureau picture yet, but I just Googled something and these people looked like they were about their business and they fit the aesthetic. So, I just added them. But feel free and we can pick this up again towards the end. But thank you guys.
Brittany and Corey, the other thing that was at the symposium that we really missed this time is Corey, can we go back to one Acorn conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this project is totally nuts, but I didn't get to fit it in. This was the flow wasn't there, Molly, but I was waiting.
No, seriously, I was going to say it, but I didn't want to steal Corey's dad joke. We were going to say, but we did put a nice picture in here of an acorn. But yeah, it's kind of nuts how crazy this is.
Awesome. Thank you both. We do have a couple questions. So going back, Corey, to your presentation explaining kind of the various funding streams, are the credits based off of adjudicated felonies versus just felony referrals?
So it's the adjudicated felonies, the 10-year average of adjudicated felonies. That's what will give and that helps in the formula creating how many credits someone will get. So you get an allotted amount of credits, and so the credits are deducted by bed days. Nothing to do with adjudications. Adjudications create credits, but a bed day will then reduce a credit. So if a kid stays for 1 day for a non-chargeable day, right, or not a public safety bed day, which I didn't explain that, so I could. But if they are staying there for what we would consider a non-public safety offense, all aggravated 1 and aggravated 2 charges in Ohio, like murder, rape, different things like that, are free beds, so they're not credited. But let's say a felony 4 comes into DYS. Those youth who stay, each day they stay, that's a bed day credit. That bed day credit is then deducted from the total number of bed day credits that they receive through the formula, which is based on the number of felony adjudications on that 10-year average. And we did a 10-year average because there was a swing in how the adjudications look each
Sure.
year.
Sure. Okay. And another question from the same person, is the funding for the YS grant and reclaim established by Ohio state legislation?
Yes, it's outlined in the Ohio Revised Code and the Ohio Administrative Code. We also have a reclaim advisory committee that is comprised of 2 juvenile court judges, 2 local juvenile court administrators, a county commissioner, our Office of Budget Management, a state legislator in the Senate and in the Ohio House, and our Department of Youth Services director that helps advise and work through any legislative change or any type of change we might see necessary. Also, as a part of that, we have to evaluate the reclaim program every 10 years, and we're in the process of doing our 30-year evaluation.
Wow. Wow. Okay, another question here. How would the state funding need to shift to turn the assessment or resource centers from court ran to community run and court supported? Do you see a shift that would need to happen there?
That, from our perspective, would be a really tough shift with the dollars that we receive, because the dollars we receive through the legislator are specifically for juvenile court operations. So juvenile courts can choose to fund those programs. So there's where we're at a bit of a disadvantage to help advocate for more community-run facilities. The way we do it through our funding mechanism now is that we encourage that partnership. That's where a lot of stuff that we use is community-based grants or pass-through grants, where we'll actually put a diversion grant out where we'll say that the diversion service or intervention has to be provided in the community. It can't be provided by the court specifically. But that's where the other big answer is statewide collaboration, where multiple agencies partner, and then funding from a group of people could go to different sources. So it's something we're working on, but it would be a really tough shift with the legislative requirements.
Yeah, it would be tough for us to give the dollars directly to community, but like Corey said, courts can give those dollars from us to the community that way. And so we do have one site whose resource and assessment center is run by a community-based organization, and those dollars came from us. Well, a portion of the dollars, not the entire funding that they have in their budget as an organization, but a portion of those dollars came from us as a state through the juvenile court. Yeah. So essentially, the community organization runs the center, but receives dollars from the courts. And so we're hoping to see more of that, where counties give the dollars to a community organization to actually run and operate and facilitate the services. Though, as it stands right now, a good portion of our resource and assessment centers, they operate with court staff or some type of court employee that is housed in a community location. Margaret, that's a comment too. You should have been called the Buckeyes instead of Acorn. That is cute.
Yeah, it was Jeff Krushmar with Case Western that thought of Acorn. Yeah. So we do have another question here from Jim. You mentioned different locations utilize different screening tools. Are there any screening tools that are standardized and utilized at all locations? And I think for you all, that is the OYAS.
Yeah, it would just be
not for every kid, right?
Yeah, the OYAS diversion tool would be the one that everyone uses. But in hindsight, maybe we would like to see some type of standardized tool, although We understand that every county is very unique and all the needs of the kids in their communities are very unique. And so we want to allow that flexibility. A lot of our resource and assessment centers also use some type of detention screening instrument or a DSI. In addition, because some of them are operating as alternatives to detention. And so they have within the court or maybe someone at a resource and assessment center on call is using a detention screening instrument. But even that really varies. So there's really not something that we as a state have required everyone to use a certain number of screens by a certain developer. But other than the OYAS diversion tool. And we've actually been a little bit flexible with that because the OYAS diversion tool doesn't really capture everything that a county may be interested in. And so if for some reason a county feels that there are other tools that will be more appropriate for the youth and families in their communities, then we've allowed that as well.
Thanks, Brittany. Let's see. We have another question here. What advice would you give to a state agency just starting the process for an assessment center?
I think the first thing I would do is anytime you're trying to implement from the state level, talk to your local jurisdictions, right? See where they're at and what they think they will need. I think that is one of the things that through the Reclaim Advisory Committee and through our meetings with our local court partners, we've really been able to establish and create an RFP that will require the certain programmatical components that are needed to sustain after we've done this for so long. So I think asking them first, but really creating a clear and concise RFP for exactly what you want. One of those being for us is a community partnership. Brittany used an example, and I think they're on the call today because Stockton County put all their letters of support. Like, we don't want this to be owned by just one person. We want this to be owned by the community, even though it is funded through local court dollars. But that would be one of my biggest suggestions is don't be afraid to let the counties tailor it to their needs, because the cookie cutter approach for us in Ohio, it never ever works. So I would say listen to them and think about that. And then we also try to think about sustainability. Competitive is the startup, but we know there are other sustainable means. So as we start this process, we talk to people about, once these dollars are gone, what are you going to do? That's one component of the RFP. And as you can see, like, some of those have made a conscious decision to close their detention centers. That doesn't mean they don't ever use a detention center bed, or they might contract for a detention center bed, but their need for detention was outweighed by those kids who need services on the front end.
Yeah. And then in addition to that, really thinking about where as a state you can, for lack of better terms, provide wiggle room and remove red tape. Again, our desire is to really do our best to invest dollars back into community and not have unnecessary barriers or red tape in place that make it increasingly difficult for folks to access those dollars or tap into those dollars. And so when appropriate, looking at your internal processes to say whether or not there's opportunities to provide a little bit of wiggle room, because ultimately the goal is just to serve kids and families and do what's best for the kids and families in our community. So.
The other thing that I'll add too, just in terms of starting at a state level, and at the NAC, we've certainly worked with a couple states outside of Ohio as well. I think whenever possible, giving states the ability to have some planning, some time and some funds to really plan, convene their community stakeholders, develop those partnerships, use data to really put together, how the assessment center is going to serve the community, at what decision points, who are they going to serve? Because I think the more that we can give resources for that initial planning and the convening, the better that sustainability is going to be, to your point, Brittany. And the other thing that I'll say is I know Ohio does this too. A couple other states do it as well. Really leaning on and kind of pointing back to the assessment center framework so that jurisdictions have access to, those core components and to some other, resources on how other assessment centers operate to lean on as they're in the development stage.
That's a great point, Molly. I think that's helped us a lot too. Utilizing the assessment tools provided by the NAC and the framework has been critical for us, and it's a requirement in our grant that it's used to establish and set up the resource and assessment center. So that's been an extremely helpful tool.
Yeah.
And then when in doubt, just say, hey, another state is doing it, so how can we do it? Just defer to someone else. That we do a lot of that. Like, hey, this person's doing it, how can we do it? So
You're not alone. You are not alone in that. We've got a couple minutes left. We have another question that came in. Did I hear it was 6.1 million just to get an assessment center up and running? What population size did this serve? Is there a ballpark figure for a small county to get an assessment center up and running?
So to start, just as we start in the 2-year grant process, the maximum amount in a 2-year grant process is 175,000 for Upstart, and that's a 2-year grant. And as time has changed, that depending on our funding level has increased and decreased. The maximum amount has been 175,000, but it's been 125,000. We've invested 6.1 million in developing 23 assessment centers. So those are the startup funds. So there is a local buy-in, and community partnership is key to doing that too. So it's not that we're not building buildings for this, right? These are programmatic operations. You can use things like these dollars for rent. You can use some of these dollars for developing programs too, and services interventions within that. When we award a grant, we expect people to be ready to move, but you'll see that we often talk about we're onboarding this site. We're getting them up and running. So it allows them to plan a little bit too. And then we see a shift, right? Boom, this isn't working. We need to do something else. So then there's that opportunity to hey, we need to make this change. So we're going to shift funding to this. And so there's a way to amend the grant and do different things like that to give us some flexibility. So that's really helpful. But typically, there's 6.1 million is not what we use to start up one. That's what we've used to start up all of the assessment centers, and we have 23 total.
Thanks for that clarification. Last question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But before I do go to this last question, I just want to say the recording and the slide deck will be emailed out to folks afterwards, so you'll have access to that. And I know that there was a request to put your information back up on the screen, Brittany. So just as we go back to this last question, if you could put that up. Do you have a standard protocol or a step-by-step for onboarding a new county?
That's a good question. Sorry, I'm multitasking here. So we really don't, in terms of onboarding new resource and assessment centers, we don't really have a step-by-step process. But what we do encourage them to do, we take time to really work with sites ahead of time if they are expressing interest in resource assessment centers. And so we work with them to, number one, talk to their local community partners and their community stakeholders to say, okay, this is the idea, talk with law enforcement to get buy-in. Because a lot of times resource and assessment centers for us are used as alternatives to detention for folks. And then once the sites have done that, seeking out space and location is usually what we ask them to really look in and to consider prior to applying. In addition to developing some type of detention screening instrument, if their resource and assessment center is going to function as an alternative to detention as well. And then once they apply, And even in the meantime, we do a lot of connecting to other resource and assessment centers around the state. And so we ask them to go check out different resource and assessment centers in different counties that are already established. We send them information around the frameworks from the NAC. And really lean towards that and ask them to use that as a guiding framework for them. And then once it gets started, we again encourage them to join and be a part of the collaborative that we've developed with sites around the state.
So if I could just add to that too, like just maybe a little bit different point of view too is we have different positions that are working with courts constantly. So our community program analysts that monitor our court funded programs are out talking to local juvenile courts about alternatives and competitive grant opportunities. So a lot of times they're laying the foundation for counties. They know their specific programs. They know what works really well. Brittany, our strategic initiatives administrator, is also then out there talking to our JDI jurisdictions about what has worked with them. So they're often linking to counties that aren't JDI counties. We have so we have those two people out on the front end, and those could be multiple different people as they're out working with courts. So there's like a foundation being laid there. But then also after that, you don't have to have a resource and assessment center to be a part of the resource and assessment center learning collaborative. So many of the people that attend that don't yet have a resource or assessment center. So they're learning and listening from others with experience who have stood these up. And Brittany and her team facilitate tours for those sites, and our local partners welcome people in to see what they're doing. So we don't have a formal onboarding process because it looks so different in each county, but we kind of do. It starts with our program monitoring, then it starts with our strategic, then it goes on to our strategic initiatives administration, and then it goes on to our learning collaboratives. And then it happens through the RFP and understanding what requirements you have to meet. And that's where the NAC framework comes into play. So those are kind of 4 steps that happen just organically, that is not necessarily written down, but that's typically how we find sites applying for and standing up resource and assessment centers.
Thanks, Corey. All right, we are 1 minute past time, but in a great way. Great discussion, great questions. Thank you all for your participation. Brittany and Corey's email and information is up on the screen. You'll also get emailed the slide deck and a copy or a recording of this webinar. So just thank you again, Brittany and Corey, for everything that you're doing for the field. This was wonderful. And we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.